Stay inside, stay inside, stay inside, don't go outside. Stay inside, stay inside, stay inside. Oh, you don't know. Stay inside, stay inside, stay inside. Don't cry, I need views. Okay, welcome back to another episode of Hand Tool Rescue in this ridiculous time that we live in. Regardless, this is a 1910s patented check canceller. It will perforate the check with a specific date and the word paid, only if I can get this thing to function once again. Now, this was sent to me from a viewer, and it was actually fairly recently, and I just happened to think it was cool enough to just give it a shot almost immediately. I really like the fact that it seemed to include a lot of different materials. You know, there's not just cast iron on this one. There's cast iron and brass. There's some aluminum, and there's a bunch of nickel plating. So it was kind of interesting. I always love the kind of mixed media, if you so want to call it. It makes just things more interesting. This entire thing was a massive pain to get apart, only because I, once again, don't really know how this works. The photos online obviously are not of disassembly. You can't see the internals, so it's kind of me learning as I go along, which seems to be usually the case lately with the last few restorations going on. So with that in mind, I don't know the correct order of operations to disassemble this thing properly. So I'm just kind of going all over, tapping things out here, unscrewing things over here, seeing what happens. And little by little, you know, you just kind of solve that puzzle and you get down to each and every part. These little knobs or pins here are what you use to lock the date in place so you can go to stamp that date. These brass rings should be able to rotate, and you pick the number, you know, December 12th, whatever, and you lock it in place with the pins, and then you can go ahead and stamp. It's kind of confusing with these holes that are just seemingly randomly placed within these rings, but you kind of have to keep in mind that whatever number is visible when you go to put the pin in, the actual corresponding hole shapes to that number is directly 180 degrees across from that pin, so that the stamping occurs appropriately. That's why it can be a little bit confusing. You'll see near the end when I clean those up what it actually looks like. So while I was disassembling, I noticed something sounding like a massive spring, and there's obviously a spring action to this up and down. I used that lever that I took off to actuate that spring, but I was very nervous that I would just magically have a part exploding in my face at incredibly high speed, because it just sounded like a thick, serious spring. So I was very concerned at this point. I had all, you know, like the face shield and everything on. Just, it's high stress, very high stress. I thought after this, tapping the pin out, it would explode. It still didn't explode, except I probably just found asbestos paper shim things. Maybe they're just paper. I don't know. I just keep it wet and hope for the best. There's the large spring. So definitely a thick spring, a tough spring, and a spring that wants to fight me. And I'll fight it. I'll fight it good. Yeah, this red paper, I'm not exactly sure. That might just be red from rust. I don't really fully know what it's made out of, but it was so thin that it's almost unnecessary. There's another part that I have no idea why it exists. or what it does, or who chose to do this. Maybe it's from something else that I'm missing. I don't fully understand that. This is the bottom punch plate, and a lot of these small screws and the plates they attach to, so there's one here on the bottom and obviously another one on the top, are super stuck in place. So most likely I'm going to end up soaking these in Evaporest first and then getting back to disassembly just to make my life easier. There's no point in making it more difficult. As for the brass label, this one luckily doesn't need to be painted or anything. Most examples I found online were just pure brass, so that makes me happy in terms of restoring that. I can just shine it up and we're done. I have this little weird bent screwdriver pry tool thing that I made, and it helps really nicely to pop these out. And since I heated up the tip, it's kind of soft on the screwdriver, so it's not going to like cut right through the brass if it's too stuck. I will save that for later, but this did expose a secret that this tool was hiding, which was pinstriping. So it seems to be gone everywhere but right under the label that was protected. So at this point I decided to definitely throw that bottom piece into the Evaporust along with pretty much everything before I remove the paint, just to see if I can unearth a pinstriping design somewhere else that I'm not seeing just visually right now. So I knew there should have been something based on photos online, but all of the pinstriping and other patterns on this, on not this specific model, but this manufacturer's other models, are all different, and I couldn't really pin down what the pinstriping was specifically for this one. So I'm glad to see that there was a little bit of pinstriping left for me to fully understand. If there was pinstriping left on the upper portions, it's gone, and I'll never know. Some of the older models had some on the upper parts, but who knows at this point. You saw there was a brazing repair on one part. I'm going to keep that, but just completely clean it up so it looks like it's not even there. Which is kind of what should have been done in the first place. Who knows? I'm still working on getting this nickel-plated piece off of the lever, and it looks like it's peened over, so the only thing I can do is fully drill it out, and then I'll fill in the metal later with some brazing or something if I so choose. Now, with everything disassembled, I can chuck it all into the glorious and delicious Evaporust, which makes my life infinitely easier every single day. This is getting kind of near the end of my life on this batch of Evaporust, so you can see how dark it is. I ended up leaving this in for a day, which is much longer than, a fresh batch, which is just, like an hour or two. I am curious after this to see which parts weren't necessarily iron or a steel, but parts that were just weird. Even this looked nickel-plated, along with the photos online. This part looked nickel-plated. This part here looked nickel-plated. The little knobs and a bunch of the screws were nickel-plated as well, so I will have to recreate that by re-nickel plating and shining up everything I can. This chip tray, if you want to call it, for the perforated holes that punch through the paper, they leave little tiny paper discs in here, so that's what this is for. It would fill up and then you would clean it out as needed. It just seems so massive that it would take like 12 billion checks to fill. So my second attempt at getting these out is not happening. They're still stuck like crazy. At least we can see that some of the holes have cleared up in the perforated aluminum piece here. It is fairly heavily corroded, so I'll have to sand that smooth. I'm trying heat. You know, you can never deny the power of the heat to get things unstuck. But in this case, it's just not going to happen, so I'll hit it while it's hot with that, and then I'll just basically have to switch to a manual impact driver and just smash these out while being delicate enough to not destroy the thin casting that this sits upon. But you can see that with one hit, it's just a nice twist of the manual impact hammer, and they're just popping right out like it's nothing. So I do love that tool and highly suggest you pick one up, because an actual impact driver would potentially overpower this and blow it to pieces. So bit of a risk with a real impact powered driver. These ones came out luckily after the evaporous fairly easily, so I didn't have to use that more aggressive method. This plate looks to be in a slightly worse condition than the bottom plate. This is the top plate, to keep that in mind. And this is the plate that keeps the pins in line so they can be pressed by that upper portion. These came off easily, and I probably made an error in judgment by taking this plate off, because I'm going to have to get all of these pins lined up and exactly back in these holes in order to reassemble this tool. So I feel like the time I spent doing that was unnecessary. But I did it, and I chose this path just to see what's under there. I don't know why I did that. I shouldn't have done that. I'm also now trying to figure out why this bottom plate, or this top plate, I guess, isn't coming out. And it finally dawned on me that this yellowing is the evaporous reaction to solder. And this plate is completely soldered in. So the screws are just there for no reason other than maybe alignment. So I can just leave this as is. There's no point in me desoldering it and soldering it back together for no reason, considering the evaporous will get into every place that I couldn't get into otherwise. It was nice to see that it wasn't lead paint, so therefore it's most likely Japanning. And Evaporous sent me this, and I have yet to even try it, so I wanted to try it on Japanning, because a lot of paint stripper won't work on Japanning at all. And due to the kind of safe nature, I was assuming it wouldn't work, because I need like the most dangerous chemical ever to remove Japanning. But it actually worked. It took off a small layer at a time. It was very slow, but it did have an effect, which I was impressed with. Usually like the citrus and other safer paint strippers just don't touch this. So it's an option. It may not be the best option for paint stripping Japanning, because there literally isn't, other than, I guess, pure acid or just sandblasting it off. It is tough as hell. Here I'm going to clean up the castings. Like I said previously, I'm just fixing the repairs and any dings or smashes that shouldn't really be there. And then I'm going straight into real Japanning of these items. You can see kind of the aluminum paid stamp plate there. It's shining up nice, and I'll shine it up even more. This is going to require multiple coats over a long time. This was like 4 or 5 days, because it's going to run on vertical surfaces. So vertical surfaces don't get massively painted, and I'll have to paint those at a later date. And the amount of coats, I can only put on a thin coat at a time, too heavy, and it's going to run everywhere. So it was really a long process to get these fully Japanned again, but it's worth it in my opinion, and I love the smell and I love working with this stuff. It's just so tough. I can throw it around my workbench, doesn't even matter. After like an hour, 375, they're delicious. Pop them out, have a taste. These pins may have been nickel plated. They also may have not been nickel plated. So all I'm going to do is sand the pitting away and give it what's essentially like a light polish, just so they look complete and without holes and very sensual. I'll also fix any damage that I'm seeing. This, I don't know what to call it, like the Rolodex holder had some damage from pins, which I didn't even know was, like someone was hammering pins in. It seems odd, but whatever. That is fixed now, and on to the nickel plating of the 700 different nickel plated items. This cam roller piece, the thumb screws, the normal screws, the handle, which is right here for the lever handle, are all going to get nickel plated. Obviously, I cleaned up the steel with sandpaper and gave it a consistent finish before nickel plating, so that I have a nice nickel plating finish. It works well, it's fairly fast, and it's actually kind of fun. I'm going to go with fairly aggressive steel wool on this and just murder it for 5 minutes until we clear all the tarnish off of it to expose the brightness and the gloriousness. So this piece turned out to be fairly corroded, that punch plate, and it's just going to require a lot of me sanding to get that going. You can see here the red in the lettering on these brass rings that I didn't really notice until later. So after wire wheeling, I went with a marker, paint marker, enamel paint marker, and filled those in, and then sanded them by hand, just to knock down the top layer of paint. Now we're finally ready for some reassembly, which I should have, maybe paid closer attention to my disassembly process when I was reassembling, but what can you do? I think the Japanning looks fantastic. It's very shiny, which is always an indicator of good Japanning. That means you have glorious polymerization of the ingredients. Along with that, it's definitely a super tough coat. I haven't seen any major runs or drips or anything. It just took a bunch of light coats. The Japanning, of course, takes hours and hours to bake because you have to heat cycle it at 100-degree increments from 200 to 400, and it's just endless. So if we move away from the pain that is the Japanning process, we get into the pain that is putting each one of these pins. It was actually about 2 hours of my time lining these up, getting it perfect. Some were still stuck for some crazy reason. Some were bent. I had to rebend them, line them up. It's more of a torture than a restoration. So if you do come across one of these, please just don't do that. I had an idea to do the pinstriping on the Bridgeport because I am an insane person. And it did work. It was definitely very straight. Obviously, the casting isn't very flat. And the angle of the pen made it so one of the pinstripes was much larger than I wanted it to be. And the fine point on the tip of the paint marker wasn't really that fine. I don't have a proper pinstriping brush or those fancy pinstripers where you just pour the paint in and kind of roll it across the piece. So this was kind of my solution for that. Maybe I'll invest in one of those if I end up with a few more things that need pinstriping. I don't know. Here's that aluminum plate piece. I ended up sanding down a lot of it just to get to where it wasn't all corroded. And that means that I don't really need the shims anymore because it's so much lower than it was initially. So I can just place this upper portion right in and hammer it in, and there's enough room for a single piece of paper. So that's kind of a little adjustment that I made due to the condition of the piece. You can see me just throwing this thing around. You know, usually we're during reassembly, I'll have a nice cloth down or something protective or be more gentle. Like I can just literally abuse this thing because Japanning doesn't care. Here's the massive spring and then the torture that is getting this top part on, because you have to compress the spring, slide this top portion forward under compression, and then push the back of it down to get the pin in. So you need 3 hands, which I just lost the third one in Vietnam. So it's kind of an issue for me personally. Anyways, it does move, so yay for me. This top portion is looking extremely sensual after the cleanup of the repair. You basically don't even know it exists, which is what I want. Only the next person who decides to strip the Japanning off will see. The only part about the Japanning that I might have messed up is that I didn't have high heat tape. So I couldn't clean up any overpainting or paint in areas I didn't want. The only way to do that was to sand it off because none of the paint strippers work on my recipe for Japanning. So it was kind of frustrating. I'm going with a razor blade and scraping by hand, and I got most of it, but some of it is still in places that I don't want it to be in. So I bought some high heat tape, and now I can mask off up to 500 degrees, which is almost what you need for Japanning. So it should produce a better result in the future, but totally a mistake on my part. Here's that part that I drilled out and nickel plated. Now I'm just going to heat it up and actually braze on just a little more length to it with some bronze filler rod, and that should be enough that I can press it into the lever and then just peen it over or tap a hole or punch a hole into it to allow it to stay in place. I nickel plated that screw as well. Obviously this attachment arm thing is nickel plated. I just kind of went crazy. Well, as crazy as the tool needed, I guess. I hammered that in, and it was just in there, so I almost didn't need to punch the other side to widen it, but it's fine. There's the little chip tray. And now I'm just going to put in the pins randomly just to see how it functions. I'm trying to make out the letters out of these holes that I'm seeing up front now. It just doesn't make sense still. Definitely hurts my brain. This also didn't make a lot of sense. There's supposed to be a small piece of leather, exactly this size, that goes into this hole. And that's supposed to stop the lever arm from smashing against the casting. But it doesn't really go all the way down anyways. So I didn't know if that was a massive concern. I messed up my first one, but on the second one, I got a good imprint, and then you can say it says paid and the date and the month and year. And then I'm just messing around, seeing what the other holes do and if everything actually comes out like I need it to. Got you good. Got you good. Anyways, I thank you all for watching this restoration on this incredibly odd tool. I didn't know this was a necessity in the 1910s, but apparently it was. I hope to see you all on the next one, and hope you're all staying safe. See you later.